Thanks so much. I want to give a special thanks to Books and Books for having me here tonight. This is the formal launch of the Dateline Havana. We decided to do it here in Miami, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today. It's particularly important that people support their independent bookstores in a time when both big chains and the internet is offering a lot of competition. It's important to have local institutions like this. I don't know of any other bookstore in the world, frankly. When you walk in, it looks like it's a Cuban bar when you first walk in, and have wonderful food as well as good books. On one of my trips to Cuba, I found out something very peculiar. Nobody I met had ever heard of Desi Arnaz. Now, after Fidel Castro, Desi Arnaz is probably the most famous Cuban in America, as far as I can tell. And when I would casually mention this to Cubans, they said, "Who?" And so then I got really intrigued. And I went out, and every Cuban that I ran into, whatever other story I was doing, people on the street, I would ask them, "Have you ever heard of Desi Arnaz?" And one woman at an agro, a farmer's market, she said, "Oh, sí, yes, I know Desi Arnaz. No, his name is Desi Arnaldo. He's a truck driver. Who is Desi Arnaz?" So I'm going on and on and on. Can't figure it out. Finally, I interviewed a middle-level Communist Party official in Havana, and an older guy in his late 60s. And I asked him that same question. He says, "Oh, of course I know Desi Arnaz. And Lucille Ball, too. They're very famous stars. And did you know? Cesar Romero, he is Cuban, too." So you might not have known that, but he's Cuban-American. So, and so I said, "How did you, I was completely flabbergasted. Not only did he know who he was, but he knew he could name off his movies and the I Love Lucy TV show and everything." And it turns out, at what I had thought was, I was kind of coming to the conclusion that maybe he had been purged from the record, that he had been considered a counter-revolutionary, or that, he denounced the revolution or something from the United States, and so he was blotted out of any mention in Cuba. Turns out the reason was actually very simple. Cuba doesn't have any reruns. The I Love Lucy show was never rerun in Cuba, and therefore, imagine in this country how many people would have ever heard of Desi Arnaz if he hadn't seen umpty zillion I Love Lucy reruns. At one time, the most popular rerun in the history of American television. So once I figured it out, the answer was actually rather simple. And I ended up writing a little story and doing a little radio piece about it. But it got me thinking, how many American reporters have gone to Cuba, stumbled across something like this? And I literally did dozens and dozens of interviews before I figured out what was actually going on. And after maybe 5 or 10 interviews at max, they write a little story. Desi Arnaz purged from memory of Cuba. And it's picked up and it circulates around. And even though it's wrong, there would be no consequences for publishing that story. There's plenty of false, I mean, not just misinterpretation or something like, plenty of just absolutely false information about Cuba that's printed in the U.S. media or aired on TV. And there's no consequences. There's no downside from your editors or from anyone else. But if you say something favorable about Cuba and might be slightly off or not quite accurate, well, then there's an avalanche of criticism. So my approach, I've been going to Cuba since 1968. I chronicle it in my book. And I kept my old notes. And my approach has always been to report from Cuba exactly the same way I would if I was in Mexico or Argentina or anywhere else in the world that I report from, which is look at the facts. If there's something wrong, try and figure out what it is, not automatically blame communism. If there's a crop shortage in Mexico, you don't say, aha, capitalism is the problem, and that somehow answers the whole thing. Well, it makes no more sense to say that about Cuba. You dig into the facts, you interview people, you dig up the information, and you make an evaluation based on what the reality is, not the preconceptions. And too many American reporters basically write their stories before they go to Cuba. And then they go down there and discover that that's exactly what they had thought all along. And they find a few people to fill in the blanks. So I want to tonight go over 3 of the more common myths about Cuba and then what the reality is. Myth number 1, Cuba is a totalitarian state whose people are so terrified of police. It's such a police state that they won't even talk to their friends and neighbors about what they really think politically. There's police on every corner. It's a complete totalitarian police state. Myth number 2, Cuba is an economic basket case propped up by Venezuela, but is on the verge of economic collapse. And myth number 3, most Cubans would leave the island or certainly vote against the Castros if there was ever fair elections held in the island, that the government basically has no popular support. Now, what's the reality? Again, this is based on my 11 trips to Cuba, including living in Cuba earlier in 2008, as well as lots of research from other sources. It's very interesting. In 2006, there was a Gallup poll. Gallup organization from the United States actually goes to Cuba and does polls every year, and they've done it over a period of years so that whatever problems there might be in poll taking, which are real in Cuba, over a period of time you can see the trend. The latest poll showed 49% of Cubans support their government. The Republican Party, they have a foundation, also did a poll in Cuba showing similar results of support for the government. This is the Republicans, by the way, U.S. Republican Party. The situation in Cuba is certainly not a democracy. I will not argue, and I do not say in the book that Cuba is a democracy. Neither is it the totalitarian state that's claimed. Cuba enjoys substantial support for its government among the people. Why? Because there's free health care, and there's free education, and there's a world-class cultural system. You can go see a symphony or jazz or great popular music for the equivalent of 20 cents. For any performance. So on all kinds of levels, the government delivers in the eyes of the people there. Now, does that mean there's freedom of speech? No. Does that mean there's freedom of assembly? No. You got to be very careful what you write and say, particularly when it comes to hot-button issues, such as relations with the United States or criticizing government leaders and so on. So it's certainly not a democracy. But probably the best way that was characterized, I interviewed Wayne Smith, who was the former head of intersection, which is like the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. And he was there in the late Carter years and early Reagan years. And he said, I asked him, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst totalitarian dictatorship, 1 being, a dictatorship but relatively less oppressive. And he said it's probably about a 2. And I think that's probably a fairly accurate description. There are no, you can see in Havana there are police on some of the street corners in the tourist areas, mainly to prevent theft from tourists and other harassment of tourists. But the minute you get out of those tourist areas, you don't see police on the street corners at all, and certainly not in the residential areas. And I traveled, and not to mention in other cities outside of Havana. So the idea that there's police on every corner, gun-toting police oppressing people is simply untrue. The question of political prisoners. That's always an issue that's raised. I've had debates now with some hardline Cubans on the radio, and, political prisoners in Cuba, the second highest number of political prisoners in the world, except for China. I don't know where they come up with these kind of figures. The reality is there's a dissident in Cuba named Elizardo Sanchez, who's recognized, who makes his career out of tracking political prisoners in Cuba. And I would make a distinction between people who are engaged in armed activity against the government or accepting money from a foreign power or otherwise taking actions to overthrow government. I think any government in the world, including the United States, puts those people in jail. I make a distinction between people like that and people who advocate, who write a leaflet or give a talk or in some other way criticizing the government but not taking up arms against it or otherwise organizing against it. And there are people like that. There are people like that in jail, and they certainly don't receive fair trials. The number of political prisoners has gone down steadily from the thousands in the 60s and 70s into the hundreds more recently, and in the last 5-6 years it's gone down steadily. According to Sanchez, there are 219 political prisoners in Cuba as of August of 2008. Now, by comparison, and there's no excuse for having any political prisoners, not people who are simply advocating change. So I think those political prisoners should be freed. But just kind of keep it in perspective. The United States currently has 250 prisoners in Guantanamo, also coincidentally in Cuba, who are held without charges, most of them, and certainly without anything close to a fair trial. So if you're going to criticize Cuba for holding political prisoners, just those numbers alone show you that certainly Cuba can't be number 2 because they got more political prisoners than the United States does.